All right, I'm going to read a couple passages of Scripture and talk a little bit about Easter. It's in Matthew. We're going to be in book of Matthew. We've been in the book of Matthew for the last few weeks. If you haven't been here, that's neither here nor there. But we've been going through the book of Matthew the last couple of weeks, and we're looking at passages of Scripture on the resurrection from Matthew chapter 28. And if you look in Matthew chapter 28, you'll notice that everything just jumps from Jesus in the tomb on Good Friday and jumps right to the resurrection the very next day. So there's like two verses back to back, and right in the middle between those two verses is a whole day. It's like all day on Saturday, but they go right from Good Friday right to Easter Sunday, and there's nothing mentioned in the Gospels right in the middle. They just jump right there. So for example, Mark, the book of Mark, Gospel of Mark says this at the end of chapter 15. It says, Joseph brought a linen shroud and taking Jesus down, wrapped him in the linen shroud and laid him in the tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled the stone against the entrance to the tomb. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laying. That's the end of the chapter. And then the very next verse says, when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him very early on the first day of the week. Doesn't mention Saturday in there at all. Luke makes this jump. It says this: they followed and saw the tomb. They saw how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. But on the first day of the week, early at dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. John says, because of the Jewish day of preparation, the Sabbath, since the tomb was closed nearby, they laid Jesus there. The very next verse. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early. And then in Matthew 28, at the very end of Matthew, Pilate's there. Pilate says, you have a guard of soldiers. Go make the tomb as secure as you can. So they went and made it secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. Then the very next verse. Now after the Sabbath, toward dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. So there's this weird thing where every time the Sabbath is mentioned. It's the Saturday, the Sabbath is there. No mention of what happens on that Saturday, that makes sense because according to Jewish custom, everyone rests on the Sabbath, right? You don't do any work on the Sabbath, so everybody rests on the Sabbath. But that's unusual for Jesus. Okay? That's weird for Jesus because normally, right, Jews rest on the Sabbath. That's just what you do. But Jesus never really does that, does he? If you've been reading through, we're reading through the New Testament here, and if you've been reading through the New Testament, you will have noticed by now that Jesus is always doing something on the Sabbath, and he's always getting in trouble for doing something on the Sabbath, right? So really, he's supposed to be resting like a good Jewish boy should do, but Jesus is always getting in trouble because he's not resting. He enters the synagogue, right? He enters the synagogue, and there's a man there with a shriveled up hand, and it's the Sabbath, and everybody's watching him. They're like, what's he going to do? What's he going to do? And he heals this man. And the Jews get upset. You're supposed to be resting, but Jesus doesn't do that, right? There's this weird story in Matthew chapter 12. It says this: Jesus is walking through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry. They began to pluck heads of grain to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, the Pharisees are Karens, like they're all Karens, every single one of them, right? The Pharisees are always saying, can I please speak with your manager? They're always doing that, constantly, right? But the Pharisees, they see the disciples, and they're like, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful to do. They're doing something that they're not supposed to do on the Sabbath. And they had a long list of things you can't do on the Sabbath. Like, it's long. It goes on and on. You can't do this, you can't do this. I've told you guys this before, but you can't cook things on the Sabbath. And so my stove at home that I bought actually has a Sabbath setting so that I can force myself not to cook on the Sabbath. It's weird. But there's a long list of things you can't do on the Sabbath. And the reason for that, right? You might just think that they're just real strict about everything. But really, the reason for that is because the Pharisees thought that the reason that the Jewish people were taken into exile and their nation was destroyed, the reason for that, they say, is because y'all weren't obeying the law, and so that's why we got in trouble with God. And so now they do the opposite. They're like, hey, if we went into exile because we weren't obeying all the rules, then maybe we can get back in God's good graces by obeying all the rules again. And so they're real strict. They're like, hey, if everybody will just comply, then we'll be okay. We'll go back, and God will reset everything, and everything will be fine. Work it, make it, do it, makes us harder, better, faster, stronger. If we just keep working, everything will be good. Let me give you another example here. This is what Jesus does. The Pharisees are like, hey, your disciples are doing something that are bad. And Jesus, he says this. He says, didn't you read? He gives them two examples. He said, didn't you read that what David did when he was hungry, and this is a story from the Old Testament, what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for him to eat because he wasn't a priest, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Didn't you read that? It's in the Bible. And God loved David. The priests are like, okay, yeah, that's in there. And then Jesus says this. He says, or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple, they also have to do things that cause the Sabbath, cause the temple to be defiled, essentially. And then he says, but they're also seen as guiltless. So he gives them these two examples, right? He says, hey, even in your own law book, his law book too, but even in your own law book, the priests and David are doing things that are, quote, unlawful on the Sabbath. And he gives this conclusion. He says this, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. He's talking about himself. He says there's something that's even better, that's even greater than the temple. And if you knew what this means, he gives them this verse, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. You would not have condemned those who are guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now that's a lot of verses. It might take you a while to chew through it in your mind. But what Jesus is getting at is this. He's saying, what you need, Pharisees, what you need is not to do or to not do in order to make yourself guilty or not guilty. He says, what you're doing and what you're not doing is not the issue. Truth be told, you're already all guilty. And that's for all of us too, right? Truth be told, we're already all guilty. So no amount of, hey, I'm going to work harder, faster, stronger in order to get better, no amount of that's going to really get you anywhere. When you're dealing with infinity, it doesn't matter if you're a good up to 11 or if you're good up to 1 billion, infinity is still out of reach. It doesn't really matter how good, strong, better, faster you get. Infinity is still out of reach. So Jesus is saying, doing this and doing that, Pharisees, ain't going to help you. What you need is mercy. What you need is grace. What you need is for God to give you favor. He goes on and there's another thing that happens immediately after that story. Another thing happens on the Sabbath. He walks into a synagogue on the Sabbath, walks into church on a Sabbath. It says a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, the Pharisees are coming after him again. They're like, hey, what are you going to do, Jesus? Is it lawful to heal this man with a withered hand on the Sabbath? What are you going to do? And they did that because they want to get him in trouble, right? They want to get Jesus in trouble. They want to see, hey, what's he going to do? Is he going to do something that he's not supposed to do on the Sabbath and try to make him look bad? And so Jesus says to this, he says, which of you, if you have a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, won't you go and pull that sheep out? Well, duh, right? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. It's lawful. There's no law against that. It's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. He says to the man, stretch out his hand, and the man stretched it out, and it was restored and healthy, just like his other. Jesus is doing good, showing grace, giving mercy on the Sabbath, and there's no law against that. Loving, caring, forgiving, you can do that anytime you want, especially on the Sabbath. That's what Jesus does, right? He works, breaking the law, but he works. He heals. He's breaking the law, but he heals on the Sabbath. He teaches. He's breaking the law, but he teaches on the Sabbath. In the book of Peter, it actually says that he goes and he preaches on that Saturday when he's in the grave. In the spiritual world, he goes and he preaches to those who are in prison. Matthew kind of hints at that as well, right? When he says, how much more value is a man than a sheep? It's lawful to do good on the Sabbath, and he heals. So it's a reminder that Jesus is going to be healing on the Sabbath. Listen to what 1 Peter says. Christ suffered once for sins, that's on the cross, right? He's suffering for sins on the cross, as the righteous one for us who are unrighteous. So he's righteous, he's good, but he's suffering on the cross for us so that he might bring us to God. He's put to death in his flesh, but he's made alive again in the Spirit, in the Spirit, he went and proclaimed the gospel, the good news, to spirits in prison. And that's a weird verse. We can talk about it later as far as all the different meanings there. But the idea is that Jesus is proclaiming good news, grace, and mercy to your spirit. Like, he wants you to do good. Don't get me wrong. He wants you to not break the law. He wants you to do what is right, but he wants you to do that from your spirit, from the inside out. Because if everything on the inside is good, then chances are you're going to do what's good in the world as well. So what Jesus did on the Sabbath before his death in the physical world, he's healing, he's forgiving, he's teaching. What he does, he continues to do even in the spiritual world. Now Jesus was judged in the flesh the way people are. In Jesus, we might live in the Spirit the way God does. Let me finish with this passage from 1 Peter. This is what 1 Peter goes on to say this. He says this. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves with the same attitude of Christ, doing good in the world, to the people you see, the people you can touch. Go out and arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, because their spirit's been changed, but rather for the will of God. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what the pagans choose to do, those without God, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, carousing, detestable idolatry. Those people are surprised that you do not join them in their recklessness, wild living, and they heap abuse on you, but they will have to give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason, the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regards to the body, but live according to God in regards to the Spirit. Jesus is at work in the world, in your spirit now, so that you might live rightly out in the physical world. That shows up on Easter Sunday. We don't realize this is some weird stuff that happens on Easter Sunday morning, and you think, oh, that was just God flexing his muscles and stuff. But you think to yourself, Jesus is raised in the Spirit. That song that we saw right before this talks about how did the grass sing, right? Did the earth rejoice? And I'm like, yeah, the physical world. Because Jesus is holding it all together, the physical world is shook because Jesus has undone death. He's stepped back out of the grave into life, and the world changes. There was a violent earthquake, Matthew 28:2 says. There was a violent earthquake, for the angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. It says that his appearance, the angel of the Lord's appearance, his appearance was like lightning. His clothes were as white as snow. And the guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. There's no more tomb anymore because Jesus is raised from the dead. Death is done. His clothes were white like lightning, clean like snow, because there's no more sin anymore for those who are in Christ. And these people were, they says, the guards were like dead men. Those who suffer, those who die, are done with sin. And the angel says to the women who are there, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy. And they ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly, Jesus met them on the road. "Greetings," he said to them. They came to him, clasped his feet. They worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." So while it's a little unusual to the Jews that Jesus would be working on the Sabbath, Jesus is inviting us into a new way of living because it's the Sabbath. Because the Sabbath is a time where Jesus heals and forgives and loves. You may not have caught that, but the angel tells the women, Jesus is going ahead into Galilee. There you will see him. And then just a second later, Jesus appears to them and says, "Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." So for you and I, I'm like, okay, that just means I'm supposed to drive down the road and go somewhere, right? But Galilee is where Jesus does his work, right? So Galilee is where Jesus is healing people and forgiving people, and he's casting out demons, and he's teaching, and he's showing people how to live as a Christian. So you get this. It says here, "Go quickly, tell his disciples he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee, into his work that he does." Don't be afraid, Jesus tells the women. "Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." Did you catch that? Go to Galilee. There you will see him. And then Jesus says, "Don't be afraid. Tell my brothers, tell the disciples, to go to Galilee. There they will see me." How do you see Jesus? According to this, it's by going to Galilee. And I can't get on a plane and just go to Galilee, right? I got work we got to do. I got to be here. So what does that say to me then? Like, I can't, if Jesus is saying this, and it says twice right here in Matthew, go to Galilee, there you will see me. And I could use some Jesus right now, right? In my life, in my world, I want to see Jesus. So what does that even mean, to go to Galilee? I think it means that if you want to see Jesus, then you have to take part in the work that Jesus is doing. It says go to Galilee. And what did Jesus do in Galilee? Galilee is where Jesus heals. Galilee is where Jesus forgives. Galilee is where Jesus gathers together and helps people, comforts people, grieves with people, rejoices with people. Galilee is where Jesus gathers together with his followers, and they celebrate together. And they do the work together. And then the angel says, Jesus says, that's how you will see me. If you need more Jesus in your life, begin doing the things that Jesus does. And you'll begin to see Jesus. Jesus is resurrected, and a new era of life and love and healing and forgiveness has dawned. Jesus is resurrected on that Sabbath, right? On the next day. On the Sabbath day of creation, has now become a permanent day of rest and celebration and recreation in the world. So you remember from Sunday school long ago, 6 days of creation, right? God creates light and darkness. God creates for 6 days, creates human beings and animals and all that on the 6th day. And then what happens on the 7th day? God rests. Right? That's the day that God stops creating. He ceases from all his work. And so what Jesus does is he goes, here's creation, here's creation, here's creation, here's the Sabbath, And now I'm making that Sabbath permanent from now on. I'm making that day of rest permanent from now on because I'm making all of creation new once again, and you can be a part of that by loving and forgiving and caring as Jesus does. In Jesus' name, you can be part of that permanent day of rest for all time. Hebrews 4:9 says, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the people who follow Jesus, there remains a Sabbath rest. For whoever enters God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Let us, therefore, strive to enter that rest so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. Jesus opens up the way for us. Jesus shows us the way, how to act, how to live, and how to love. And he shows himself to us when we act and live and love as he does. If we trust in the way that he acted and lived and loved, if we trust that what he has for us is enough, if we follow him, so it means to follow him in faith, to trust that what Jesus has for us is enough for life, for godliness, in order to live in this world. And we follow his way. He promises that he will show himself to you and give you the grace that he has offered. It's no more about living. It's no more about how much can I do for God. It's about striving to find Jesus in what he has done for us. We're going to sing our closing hymn. It is Because He Lives, I Can Face Tomorrow. Those are the words of that hymn. It's number 292 in your hymnals if you want it. We'll have it up on the screen as well. But 292. Would you stand? Let's sing this together. 292.